My name is Leah Delvecchio. I'm 31 years old and 3 weeks ago, I stood in the grand lobby of the Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables, Florida, while my sister's friends laughed at me loud enough for the concierge to look up from his desk. My own mother was 6 feet away. She didn't say a word. She just reached over, straightened Desiree's wrap and went back to smiling for photos. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman they were laughing at had quietly signed a private consulting and partnership agreement with the Biltmore's parent management group 4 months earlier. They didn't know that the event coordinator who had personally designed the floral arrangements for Desiree's birthday party had been consulting with me on venue aesthetics for 2 seasons. And they absolutely did not know what was going to happen 40 minutes later when the hotel's general manager stepped through the ballroom doors, scanned the room and walked directly toward me. But before I get to that moment, I need to take you back to the beginning. Because this story didn't start at the Biltmore. It started a long time ago in a house where one daughter was a chandelier and the other was a lamp someone shoved in a closet and forgot about. And if you're new here, before we go any further, if stories about family, betrayal and knowing your own worth resonate with you, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. I share new stories every week and trust me, this one is just getting started. I want to be clear about something before I tell you about the party. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I don't need it. I tell it because for a long time I carried a version of myself that was shaped entirely by what my family reflected back at me, and that version was wrong. Embarrassingly, painfully wrong. And it took one night in a hotel ballroom in South Florida for me to finally put that version down for good. Growing up in the Delvecchio house in Coral Gables meant growing up in Desiree's orbit. She was 4 years older than me, effortlessly pretty in the way that made adults stop mid-sentence and say things like, "Oh my goodness, she looks like a young Sophia Loren." My mother, Gloria, had been a regional beauty queen in her 20s, and she found in Desiree a continuation of something she'd always considered her finest achievement. I was the second daughter. The afterthought. The one who came along and disrupted what had already been a perfect picture. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's just the truth, the plain, documented truth of my childhood, and pretending otherwise would make me a liar. Every school play, every recital, every soccer tournament, our parents showed up for Desiree first. If I happened to be in the same event, they'd stay for my part, sure, but you could feel the difference in the room. There was a different quality of attention, like the difference between a spotlight and ambient lighting. Desiree got the spotlight. I got to exist in the general glow of her being present. I was a good student, better than Desiree academically, though nobody made a production of it. When I graduated high school with honors, my mother's response was to start planning Desiree's engagement party, even though Desiree had been dating her boyfriend Marcus for only 6 months. When I got into the University of Miami on a partial scholarship and quietly paid the rest myself through 2 part-time jobs, the family dinner conversation that week was about whether Desiree should take a promotion in Atlanta or stay closer to home. I sat at that table for 40 minutes and no one mentioned college once. I stopped expecting celebration somewhere around my sophomore year. That was the year I figured out that waiting for my family to notice me was a kind of slow, voluntary suffering, and I was done volunteering. So I put my head down and I worked. I studied hospitality management because I'd always been quietly obsessed with the architecture of how spaces make people feel, how a well-designed room could shift someone's entire emotional state the moment they walked through the door. I interned at 2 boutique hotels in Miami during my junior and senior years. By the time I graduated, I had a job offer before the ink on my diploma was dry. I didn't tell my family about the job offer for 3 weeks. Not because I was hiding it, but because I'd learned that sharing things with my family meant either watching them go unacknowledged or worse, watching my mother find a way to redirect the conversation back to Desiree within 60 seconds. So I just lived my life quietly. I built things quietly. I got good at being quiet. 7 years after graduation, I was a hospitality consultant with a client list that included 4 boutique hotel groups across South Florida and 2 luxury resort properties in the Florida Keys. I had built my business from nothing, starting with a single contract I landed by cold emailing a general manager at a small hotel in Coconut Grove who took a chance on me when I was 24 years old. I had a reputation in the industry that I was genuinely proud of. I had a life that, when I looked at it clearly and honestly, was exactly the life I'd wanted to build. My family knew none of this. Not in detail anyway. They knew I did something with hotels, in the vague way you know a neighbor has some kind of office job. Nobody had ever asked for specifics. Nobody had ever sat down with me and said, Tell me about what you do, tell me what you've built. So I never told them, and the gap between who they thought I was and who I actually was grew wider every year without any of us noticing. The invitation to Desiree's birthday party came through a group text. Not a phone call, not a personal message. A group text with 11 recipients, a photo of a floral arrangement and the message: Desiree's 35th, Saturday the 14th, Biltmore Hotel, Coral Gables, cocktail attire, 7 p.m., do not be late. Love, Mom. There was a follow-up text 2 hours later addressed only to me. It said, Leah, please don't wear anything too plain. This is a nice place and Desiree's friends are sophisticated. Try to look like you made an effort. I stared at that message for a long time. I want you to understand what it means to receive a text like that from your mother. It wasn't the words exactly, though the words were bad enough. It was the assumption embedded in them, the casual, completely unexamined certainty that I needed to be reminded to present myself appropriately, that without her guidance I would show up embarrassing and underdressed and wrong. It was the fact that she'd taken the time to send that message specifically to me and no one else. I put my phone down and opened my laptop. I pulled up my email and scrolled back 4 months to a thread I hadn't thought about in weeks. It was an email chain with Robert Vega, the regional director of the hotel management group that operated the Biltmore among 6 other luxury properties in Florida. We'd finalized a consulting partnership agreement in that thread. I was 3 months into a 12-month engagement with their properties, advising on guest experience design and staff training curriculum. The Biltmore was one of my active client sites. I read the email chain slowly. Then I closed my laptop and sat for a while with the strange specific feeling of knowing something that no one around you knows. I hadn't planned any of this. I hadn't purchased the Biltmore. I hadn't engineered a situation. I had simply built a career and done my job, and my family had simply never bothered to ask what that job was. I typed back a reply to my mother's text. It said, I'll be there. Don't worry about what I'm wearing. I set my phone face down on the desk. 4 months of professional work at that property, and my mother's concern was whether I'd embarrass Desiree in front of her sophisticated friends. I wasn't angry. I was just very, very done pretending that the dynamic in my family was acceptable. Something had been building in me for years, quiet and patient, the way water builds behind a dam. I could feel it now. Saturday was 6 days away. I spent the next few days going about my normal work schedule, which included 2 site visits to the Biltmore that week. On Wednesday I met with the food and beverage director to review a training module I'd developed for the front-of-house staff. On Thursday I sat in on a guest experience debrief with the events team. I walked through that lobby twice, nodded at staff members who knew exactly who I was, and thought about Saturday with a feeling I can only describe as quiet anticipation. Not excitement. Not dread. Just the calm, settled feeling of someone who knows that a particular chapter is about to close, and has decided to let it close on her own terms. I called my best friend Trisha the night before the party. She'd known me since college and was the only person outside of my professional world who had any real sense of what I'd built. I told her about the group text and my mother's follow-up message. I told her about the consulting agreement. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, Leah, you know I love you, so I mean this with full respect. Do not let them take that night from you. Whatever happens, whatever they say, you walk in there knowing exactly who you are. I told her I already did. And I meant it. Saturday arrived the way significant days always do. Ordinary on the surface, loaded underneath. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat on my apartment balcony watching the morning light spread across the Coral Gables skyline. I wasn't nervous. That surprised me a little. I had expected some version of the old feeling, that tight pre-family event anxiety I'd carried for most of my adult life, the low hum of knowing I was about to walk into a room where I was the least important person present. But it wasn't there. What I felt instead was clear. So, like the surface of water before anything touches it. I had already decided what I was going to wear. Not because of my mother's text, but in spite of it. A deep navy wrap dress, simple and well cut, the kind of dress that disappears in a room full of loud fashion choices and somehow manages to look like the most intentional thing there. Small gold earrings. Nothing else. I wasn't going to dress to impress Desiree's friends. I was going to dress for myself, which for the first time in a long time felt like exactly enough. I arrived at the Biltmore at 7:15. If you've never been, let me paint the picture for you because the setting matters. The Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables is not just a hotel. It's a landmark. Built in 1926, it rises above the surrounding neighborhood like something that wandered in from another century and simply refused to leave. The tower alone is modeled after the Giralda Bell Tower in Seville, Spain. The lobby has 30-foot ceilings with hand-painted details, marble floors worn smooth by nearly 100 years of footsteps, and a quality of light that doesn't feel entirely electric. It feels earned. Walking into the Biltmore for the first time, most people slow down without meaning to. They feel the weight of the place and they adjust. I had walked through those doors dozens of times in the past 4 months. I knew the layout of the ballroom wing, the back corridors, the catering entrance on the east side of the building. I knew which elevator the event staff preferred and which section of the parking structure had the best drainage. I knew this building the way you know a place you've worked in seriously, with your hands and your attention and your professional judgment. Tonight, as a guest at my sister's birthday party, I knew it better than anyone else in the room. The party was in the Alhambra Ballroom. I gave my name at the welcome table near the entrance and a young woman in a black uniform found me on the list, smiled and handed me a printed program. Desiree's party had a program. 16 glossy pages with a timeline of the evening, a menu written in both English and Italian, and a full-page photograph of Desiree in a white gown on the hotel terrace, her dark hair falling perfectly, her smile aimed at something just off camera. The caption read, "Celebrating 35 extraordinary years." I looked at the photo for a moment, then tucked the program under my arm and walked into the ballroom. The room was beautiful. I'll give Desiree that without reservation. She had taste, inherited from our mother and sharpened over years of caring intensely about surfaces. The tables were draped in ivory linen with centerpieces of pale orchids and eucalyptus. Candles in tall glass columns. A playlist of low ambient jazz floating above the conversation. Around 80 guests already filling the space, the women in bright cocktail dresses, the men in blazers, everyone holding champagne flutes and laughing at the particular volume of people who know they're at a good party. Near the back of the room, a professional photographer moved between groups, a second shooter positioned near the entrance to catch arrivals. I got a glass of water from the bar and stood for a moment near the edge of the room taking it in. I spotted my mother almost immediately. Gloria Delvecchio was stationed near the center of the space like a general surveying a successful campaign. She was in a floor-length emerald gown that she texted me a photo of 3 weeks earlier with the caption, "Found the perfect dress, Desiree approved." She was laughing at something a man in a cream blazer was saying, her hand on his arm, her posture radiating the particular satisfaction of a woman whose event is going exactly as planned. She saw me about a minute after I arrived. I watched her expression move through 3 phases in quick succession. Recognition, assessment, and then something that landed between disappointment and resignation. She crossed the room without rushing. "You're here," she said when she reached me, which was not a greeting so much as an observation delivered with mild surprise, as if she had expected me to cancel. Her eyes moved over my dress quickly. "That color is a little dark for a celebration, don't you think?" I told her I thought navy was fine. She made a small sound that wasn't quite disagreement and wasn't quite agreement, and then she said, "Desiree's over by the terrace doors. Go say hello before she gets too busy." Then she turned and walked back toward the man in the cream blazer. That was the entire conversation. "No, how are you?" "No, I'm glad you came." 4 years since I had last seen her in person, and the exchange lasted 45 seconds and ended with instructions. I found Desiree near the terrace doors exactly where my mother said she would be, holding court in a group of 6 women who were all laughing at slightly different intervals, the way people do when they're performing enjoyment rather than feeling it. Desiree herself was stunning and she knew it. She was wearing a champagne-colored dress that caught the candlelight, her hair swept up, a bracelet on her wrist that I was fairly certain cost more than my first car. She saw me coming and her expression shifted into the version of warmth she reserved for people she tolerated in public. "Leah," she said, leaning in for the kind of hug where both people's shoulders stay exactly where they are. "You made it." The way she said it carried a thin edge of surprise that she didn't bother to fully conceal, as if my attendance had been a matter of some uncertainty. She introduced me to the group without hesitation. "This is my sister Leah. She works in hotels." One of the women, tall with a sharp geometric bob and the kind of confidence that comes from spending money consistently and well, raised an eyebrow slightly. "Oh, how fun," she said, her voice pleasant and entirely uninterested. "Like front desk." There was a small ripple of laughter through the group. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either. The laughter of people who assume they know where a person stands in a hierarchy and find the position mildly amusing. I looked at the woman with the geometric bob and smiled. "Consulting," I said simply. She nodded once, already turning back to Desiree. "Done with me in under 3 seconds." Desiree caught my eye for just a moment and I saw something there, not shame. Desiree didn't do shame, but a small flicker of satisfaction at the exchange. She had chosen that introduction deliberately. She works in hotels. 3 words designed to position me as service staff at my own sister's party. I excused myself and stepped back from the group. I wasn't humiliated. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something colder and more clarifying than humiliation. I felt confirmed. Every vague, unformed suspicion I'd carried about how my family genuinely saw me had just been gift-wrapped and handed to me in front of 6 witnesses. She works in hotels. 4 months of active consulting work at the very building we were standing in, and that was the summary my sister offered. Not because she didn't know the details. Because she hadn't bothered to learn them. There is a difference between those 2 things and it matters. I moved toward the far side of the room and found an unoccupied stretch of wall near a tall floral arrangement. From there I had a clear view of the room without being in the middle of it. I watched my mother work the space, moving from cluster to cluster with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades being the most charming person in any room. I watched Desiree accept compliments with the fluid grace of someone who had been receiving them since childhood and fully expected them to continue indefinitely. I watched the photographer circle the room, shooting everything that looked like a celebration. I was thinking about a conversation I'd had 3 months earlier with Robert Vega, the regional director. We'd been walking the east corridor of the Biltmore after a site debrief when he'd stopped and said, "Leah, I want to talk to you about expanding this engagement. We've been looking at a guest experience redesign across 4 of our Florida properties and I think you're the right person to lead it." I had told him I was interested. We had scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following month. That meeting had gone well. The expanded contract was currently sitting in my email drafts, not yet signed but very close. Standing against that wall, watching my sister's friends laugh and my mother hold court and the whole expensive, carefully constructed evening unfold around me, I thought about that conversation. I thought about the fact that the general manager of this hotel, a man named Gerald Okafor who had been with the Biltmore for 11 years, knew my name, knew my work, and had personally thanked me 2 weeks ago for a training document I'd submitted that his front-of-house staff had responded to with unusual enthusiasm. I thought about the fact that Gerald was working tonight. He'd mentioned it in passing during my Thursday visit, something about a large private event requiring his presence. She works in hotels. Sure. I took a slow sip of water and waited. The toast started at 8:30. I had been at the party for just over an hour by then, moving quietly through the edges of the evening, accepting a glass of champagne I barely touched, exchanging small talk with a few guests who introduced themselves with the polite curiosity of people who couldn't quite place me. Nobody was rude. Nobody went out of their way to include me either. I existed at that party the way a painting exists in a room full of people having conversations, present, visible if you looked directly at it, otherwise completely unremarkable. Desiree's best friend Claudia took the microphone first. She was a corporate attorney from Brickell, sharp and precise in the way of someone who had trained herself to perform warmth in rooms that required it. She told a story about meeting Desiree at a charity gala 7 years ago and knowing immediately that she was in the presence of a woman who was going places. She used the phrase force of nature twice. The room laughed in all the right places. Claudia raised her glass and everyone followed, and the moment was exactly as polished as everything else about the evening. Then Marcus stood up. Desiree's boyfriend of 2 years, a developer from Miami Beach with easy charm and an easy smile and the particular confidence of a man who had never in his life been the least important person in any room he entered. He talked about Desiree with genuine warmth, I'll give him that. He said she was the most deliberate person he'd ever met, that she never did anything accidentally, that every choice she made was made with intention. He said this like it was a compliment. Standing where I was standing, knowing what I knew about that guest list and my mother's text message and the introduction I'd received an hour earlier, I heard it slightly differently. He was right though. Desiree was deliberate. She always had been. My mother went last among the formal toasters. She rose from her seat at the head table with the unhurried grace of someone who had been waiting for this moment and had planned what she was going to say with considerable care. Gloria Delvecchio was a gifted speaker in the specific way of people who understand that emotion, when deployed at the right moment, is more persuasive than any argument. She talked about Desiree's childhood. The recitals, the academic honors, the way Desiree had always known exactly what she wanted and gone after it without apology. She talked about watching her oldest daughter become a woman she admired, a woman she could point to with pride. Her voice caught in exactly the right place. Several guests reached for their napkins. She did not mention me once. I was standing 15 feet from the head table. There were 2 daughters in that room and she spoke for 4 minutes and referenced only one of them. A few guests glanced in my direction during the speech, not out of cruelty, but with the slightly uncomfortable awareness of people who have just realized something awkward is happening and aren't sure where to look. I kept my expression neutral. I was getting good at that. When the applause died down and the room returned to its normal rhythm of conversation and movement, I set my barely touched champagne on a passing server's tray and checked my watch. 8:47. Gerald Okafor, the general manager, typically finished his evening rounds between 8:30 and 9 on event nights. I knew this because I had been present for 3 of those rounds during my site visits. He moved through the property methodically, checking in with the events coordinator, the head of catering, the front desk supervisor. He was thorough and quiet and he paid attention to everything. I had not contacted Gerald before the party. I had not told him I would be attending as a personal guest. There was a part of me that had considered sending a quick professional note, but I hadn't. Something in me wanted to see the evening unfold without any prearranged choreography. Whatever happened tonight, I wanted it to be real. I was standing near the east side of the ballroom, close to the corridor that connected the Alhambra to the hotel's main atrium, when I heard Desiree's voice carrying over the ambient noise of the room. She was nearby, around the corner of a tall floral column, speaking to Claudia and 2 other women I didn't recognize. I wasn't trying to listen. I simply hadn't moved yet, and voices travel in high-ceilinged rooms whether you want them to or not. She's always been like this, Desiree was saying. Her voice had the loose, slightly amplified quality of someone 2 glasses of champagne into a celebration. Hovering at the edges of everything like she's waiting for someone to invite her into the actual party. There was laughter. Quiet, enclosed laughter, the kind shared between people who feel safe. My mother invited her because not inviting her would have been a whole production. But honestly, she could have stayed home and the night would have been exactly the same. More laughter. Then Claudia's voice, lower, she seems uncomfortable. And Desiree again without hesitation, she always seems uncomfortable. It's exhausting honestly. Some people just don't know how to be in a room. I stood completely still. There are moments in your life that function like a key turning in a lock. Not dramatic, not loud, just the small precise sound of something opening that had been closed for a long time. That was one of those moments. Not because the words were surprising. They weren't. I had carried a version of those words with me for most of my life, had heard them in subtler forms at every family gathering since I was a teenager. What made that moment significant was the clarity it produced. A clean, cold, absolute clarity. I was done. Not angry done, not hurt done. Simply finished. The way you are finished with something when you have finally seen it completely and have no further questions about its nature. I stepped away from the floral column and walked back toward the center of the room. As I did, I saw Gerald Okafor enter through the corridor door at the far end of the ballroom. He was in his usual evening attire, dark suit, no tie, the small Biltmore pin on his lapel that all senior staff wore at formal events. He had a brief word with the events coordinator just inside the door, glanced at something on the tablet she was holding, nodded, and then lifted his gaze to do his habitual scan of the room. His eyes found me in approximately 4 seconds. That was how long it took. I watched the recognition land on his face, the slight adjustment in his expression that happens when you spot someone you know professionally in an unexpected personal context. He said something brief to the events coordinator and then began moving through the room toward me. Not hurrying. Just moving with the quiet directness of a man who always knew exactly where he was going. I was aware, in my peripheral vision, that Desiree had emerged from around the floral column with her group. She was watching Gerald cross the room with the mild proprietorial interest of a hostess tracking the movement of hotel staff at her event. I was aware that my mother had also noticed, her head turning slightly from her conversation near the gift table. Neither of them had any reason yet to pay particular attention to where Gerald was headed. The room was full of guests and staff interactions were constant and unremarkable. Gerald reached me and extended his hand. "Ms. Delvecchio," he said, and his voice was clear and professional and carried precisely the register of warm professional respect that 11 years of senior hospitality management had given him. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to have you here." He shook my hand with the firm courtesy he extended to clients and partners, not to party guests. Not to women who worked in hotels. "I was hoping to connect with you this week about the expanded proposal. Robert mentioned you were close to a decision. Would you have a few minutes before the end of the evening?" The room did not go silent. That only happens in movies. What happened was more specific and more interesting than cinematic silence. The small cluster of people nearest to us, maybe 6 or 7 guests who had been engaged in their own conversations, gradually became less engaged in those conversations. The shift was subtle but it was real. Words slowed. Eyes moved. The way attention moves in a room when something happens that doesn't quite fit the established pattern of the evening. Desiree had stopped walking. I could see her in my peripheral vision, still, her champagne glass held at a slight angle, her eyes moving between Gerald and me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. Not yet. It was something more fundamental than either of those things. It was the expression of someone who has been operating with a set of assumptions about the world and has just encountered data that does not fit those assumptions and has not yet figured out what to do with the discrepancy. My mother had gone very still near the gift table. The man she'd been speaking to was still talking. She was no longer listening to him. I looked at Gerald Okafor and smiled the way you smile at a colleague you respect. "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to find a few minutes. The proposal is in good shape. I think you'll be pleased with where we landed." He nodded, told me he'd circle back before 9:30, thanked me for being there, and moved on to the next point on his rounds with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had a full building to oversee. I turned back to the room. Desiree was still standing where she'd stopped. Around her, her friends were exchanging glances with the careful, calibrated expressions of people who have just witnessed something they want very much to discuss but understand they cannot discuss yet. Not here. Not in front of the subject of the conversation. Some people just don't know how to be in a room. I thought about that. Then I picked up a fresh glass of water from a passing tray, found a comfortable spot near the terrace doors, and let the evening continue. Desiree found me 9 minutes later. I know it was 9 minutes because I had checked my watch when Gerald walked away and I checked it again when I heard her heels on the marble floor behind me. She moved fast when she was unsettled, always had even as a child. I remembered that about her suddenly and clearly, the way she used to charge across the backyard toward whatever had disturbed her orbit, not cautiously, not strategically, just fast and direct and slightly too loud. She stopped beside me at the terrace doors and for a moment she didn't say anything. She stood next to me looking out at the same view, the Biltmore's famous courtyard below, the pool lit from underneath, the manicured hedges casting long shadows in the evening light. It was a beautiful view. I had always thought so. I had looked at it from this exact spot during a site walk with the events coordinator back in February and made a note in my project file that the terrace doors needed better lighting on the interior side to take advantage of the contrast. That note had made it into the recommendations report I submitted to Robert Vega the following week. "Who is that man?" Desiree said finally. Not a question exactly. More like someone thinking out loud who had forgotten they were standing next to another person. "Gerald Okafor," I said. "He's the general manager." She turned to look at me. "Why does he know you?" I kept my eyes on the courtyard. "Because I've been consulting for this property for 4 months. The silence that followed had a texture to it. I could feel her processing, the way you can feel the temperature change in a room before a storm arrives. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the register she used when she was trying to sound casual about something that was bothering her significantly. "Consulting," she repeated. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means Robert Vega's management group hired me to advise on guest experience design and staff training across their Florida properties. The Biltmore is one of 6 sites in the engagement." I paused. The expanded contract would add 3 more. Another silence. Longer this time. Out in the courtyard, a couple was walking along the pool's edge, their voices too distant to make out, their laughter carrying up to us in fragments. You never said anything, Desiree said. You never asked. She made a small sharp sound, not quite a laugh. That's not fair. She shifted direction the way she always did when a conversational line wasn't serving her. How long have you been doing this? This consulting thing? 7 years. 7. She said the number like it was in a foreign language she was encountering for the first time. 7 years, and you never once mentioned it at a family dinner. At Christmas. At anything. I turned to look at her then. I wanted to see her face when I said the next part. Desiree, at the last 4 Christmases I attended, the combined amount of time anyone spent asking about my life was under 10 minutes. Total. Across 4 years. I let that land. I could have announced I'd been to the moon and someone would have said that's nice and gone back to talking about your promotion. She opened her mouth. I kept going, not unkindly, just steadily. I'm not saying that to attack you. I'm saying it because it's true and you know it's true, and I think some part of you has always known it. Her jaw tightened. The champagne glass in her hand rotated slowly, a nervous habit she'd had since college. This is my birthday party, she said quietly. I know. You're doing this tonight on purpose. I'm standing at a terrace door having a conversation you started, I said. Gerald Okafor came over to speak to me because he works here and I'm his client. I didn't arrange that. I didn't plan any of this. I came to your party because you're my sister and I thought maybe this time would be different. I paused. I was wrong about that before I even walked in the door, but I came anyway. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, I wasn't expecting guilt, but something adjacent to it. A flicker of something unguarded. It was there for only a second before her expression reorganized itself into the composed, slightly imperious look she defaulted to when she felt cornered. I introduced you exactly the way I understand your life, she said. I didn't know. I can't apologize for something I didn't know. I'm not asking you to apologize for not knowing, I said. I'm pointing out that you didn't know because you didn't ask. There's a version of tonight where you introduced me to your friends and said something like, my sister works in hospitality, I actually don't know the details. Leah, tell them what you do. That version exists. You chose a different one. She looked away. Across the room, I could see our mother watching us from a distance, her body angled toward our conversation in the specific way of a woman who wants to intervene but has read the room well enough to know this is not the moment. She works in hotels, I said quietly. Not angry. Just returning the words to where they came from so she could hear them outside the safety of the group that had laughed at them. That's what you told them. Front desk was the follow-up from your friend. And you smiled. Desiree said nothing. I'm not asking for a dramatic apology in front of your guests, I continued. I'm not going to make a scene. That was never what this was about. But I need you to understand that I heard what you said earlier. Around the corner of the floral column. About me hovering at the edges. About the night being exactly the same if I hadn't come. I watched her carefully. I heard all of it. The color that moved into her face was slow and deep. Not a blush. Something more thorough than that. I watched her grip on the champagne glass tighten until her knuckles went pale. That was a private conversation, she said, and her voice was very controlled. The voice of someone holding a great deal in with considerable effort. It was. And I wasn't trying to listen. But I heard it. And I think you should know that I heard it and that it doesn't actually hurt me the way it would have 5 years ago. That's not a performance. I'm genuinely telling you that. Because I spent a long time allowing what you and Mom thought of me to define how I understood myself, and I don't do that anymore. I looked at her steadily. I built something real. I did it alone and I did it quietly, and it has nothing to do with whether either of you ever acknowledge it. But I'm done pretending I didn't build it just to make the dynamic in this family more comfortable. Desiree was quiet for so long that I thought she might simply walk away. That would have been consistent with the version of her I'd grown up with. The one who exited conversations that required something she wasn't prepared to give. But she didn't walk away. She stood there, and the champagne glass stopped rotating, and she looked at me with an expression that was stripped of all its usual performance. Just her face. My sister's actual face. I didn't know it was that bad, she said finally. And her voice was different. Smaller. The voice of someone telling a partial truth and knowing it's only partial. I think you knew some of it, I said. Not as an accusation. Just as the truth. She didn't argue with that. Our mother arrived then, moving in with the precise timing of a woman who had been monitoring the conversation's temperature from across the room and had decided it needed managing. "Girls," she said, her voice smooth and social, the tone designed to signal to any nearby guests that whatever was happening was warm and normal and nothing to look at. She touched Desiree's arm briefly. "Leah, it's lovely that you're talking, but Desiree's cake is coming out in a few minutes and we need her near the center table." I looked at my mother. Gloria Del Vecchio in her emerald gown, her hair perfect, her smile exactly calibrated. The woman who had spent 4 minutes toasting one daughter and not found a single second for the other. The woman who had texted me the morning of the party to tell me to dress appropriately for a place I had been walking through professionally for 4 months. "I'll let you get back to your guests," I said to Desiree. Then I looked at my mother. "Congratulations on the party, Mom. The room looks beautiful." I meant that genuinely. It did look beautiful. The orchids were exceptional. I had actually mentioned to the events coordinator back in March that the Alhambra looked best with pale florals against the warm stone walls, and apparently that note had found its way into the party design. I didn't mention that. I just let it be a beautiful room. My mother studied me with the look she used when she was trying to determine whether something was a compliment or a challenge. She couldn't quite tell. That, in itself, felt like progress. Desiree said my name once as I turned to walk away. I paused. She was looking at me with that same stripped expression, the one underneath all the polish. "The hotel," she said. "The consulting. What you've built." Pause. "How many properties?" "Currently 6 active clients," I said. "Potentially 9 after next month." She nodded slowly. Just once. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't absolution. But it was the first time in my adult life that my sister had looked directly at something I'd accomplished and let herself actually see it. I didn't need her to say anything else. The looking was enough for now. I walked back toward the center of the ballroom. Behind me I heard my mother begin steering Desiree toward the cake table, her voice resuming its social ease, the machinery of the evening clicking back into motion. The jazz quartet had shifted to something with more rhythm. Guests were moving to the small dance floor near the back. The party was doing what parties do, absorbing disruption and continuing because celebrations are stubborn that way. I found a quiet spot near the bar and ordered a sparkling water. Gerald would be circling back around 9:30. I had a proposal to discuss. The evening wasn't over yet. Gerald found me at 9:28. I had been sitting at a small table near the bar, watching the party wind through its final hour. The dance floor had filled up. Claudia was leading a circle of women through something enthusiastic if not quite choreographed. Marcus had loosened his tie near the terrace. My mother was back at the gift table, receiving the last of the evening with the satisfied air of a woman whose event had gone exactly as planned. Desiree was at the center of the dance floor, laughing, her champagne glass raised, the picture of a woman celebrating the life she had designed. She hadn't looked in my direction since our conversation at the terrace doors. I didn't read it as coldness. I read it as someone who needed to keep moving until she figured out what she felt. Gerald set a leather portfolio on the table. "The proposal is excellent," he said. "Robert shared the draft last week. The framework you've built is exactly what we've been trying to articulate internally for 2 years. We talked for 20 minutes. Specific and detailed, the way professionals talk when neither of them needs to perform competence for the other. 3 additional properties, onboarding timelines, training modules, the resort near Marco Island that needed a site visit before I could commit to a final scope." At one point during our conversation I became aware that my mother had drifted closer to our area of the room. Not close enough to be obvious. She had positioned herself at a nearby high-top table with a woman I didn't recognize, her back angled slightly toward us in the specific posture of someone pretending not to listen while listening carefully. I noticed and said nothing and continued talking to Gerald about onboarding timelines. When we wrapped up, Gerald closed the portfolio. "I want to say something outside the scope of our professional conversation," he said. "The work you've done with this property in 4 months has had a measurable impact on the front-of-house team. Guest satisfaction scores this quarter are the highest we've recorded in 3 years. I don't say that to flatter you. It's documented and you should know it." Thanked him. He stood, shook my hand and moved back into the rhythm of his rounds. I sat for a moment after he left with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work had just been confirmed by a person with no reason to be generous about it. My mother appeared at the edge of my table approximately 45 seconds after Gerald walked away. She didn't ask if she could sit. She pulled out the chair he had vacated and sat down and placed her hands flat on the table in front of her, a gesture I recognized from childhood as the precursor to a serious conversation. "How long," she said, "has that been going on?" "The consulting engagement?" 4 months at this property. 7 years overall. Her eyes moved to the space Gerald had just occupied. "He said guest satisfaction scores." "He did. He meant it. Gerald Okafor doesn't say things he doesn't mean. That's actually one of the reasons his properties perform the way they do." She was quiet. Her hands on the table were still. My mother had beautiful hands, always had, and in that moment under the warm ballroom light they looked older than I remembered them being, the skin thinner, the tendons more visible. She was 62 years old. I had spent most of my adult life waiting for her to see me, and somewhere in the past hour that waiting had quietly, without ceremony, come to an end. What I felt sitting across from her now was not the old hunger. It was something gentler and more final than hunger. It was just the plain sad recognition of time that had passed and could not be recovered. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't. You should have told me." There was no force behind it. It was barely even a position. More like a reflex, the default response of a woman who was not accustomed to being on the wrong side of a conversation and was reaching for familiar ground. "Mom." I kept my voice very even. "I tried to tell you things for years. When I landed my first contract, when I moved into my own office, when I brought on my first staff member. I tried to share those things, and every time I did, the conversation moved somewhere else within 2 minutes. After a while I stopped trying." "That's not an accusation. It's just what happened." She looked down at her hands. "Desiree always had more to say. Desiree always had more people listening," I said. "There's a difference." The silence between us was not hostile. That was the thing I hadn't expected. I had imagined this conversation, some version of it, for years, and in every version I had imagined it would be charged and painful and full of the accumulated weight of 30 years of being overlooked. But it wasn't charged. It was just quiet. 2 people sitting across a table in a beautiful room, one of them finally saying a true thing and both of them knowing it was true. "I'm proud of you," my mother said. The words came out carefully, like she was carrying something fragile. "I want you to know that. I don't think I've said it the right way. I don't think I've said it at all." She paused. "That's my fault." I looked at her. Gloria Del Vecchio in her emerald gown, the woman who had texted me to dress appropriately and introduced my sister for 4 minutes and navigated this entire evening with the social precision of someone who had been managing surfaces her whole life. And now, at 20 minutes to 11 in the Alhambra ballroom of the Biltmore Hotel, she was sitting across from me with her hands flat on the table saying something real. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "I meant it." She nodded once. Her eyes were bright but controlled. My mother did not cry in public. She never had. "Are we going to be all right?" she asked. "You and I." I thought about that honestly before I answered. "I think we can be," I said. "But it has to be different. I'm not going to keep making myself smaller so the family dynamic is comfortable. I'm not going to stop sharing what I've built because nobody asks. And I need you to be interested. Actually interested, not politely interested for 5 minutes before the conversation goes somewhere else." "That's fair," she said quietly. "I know it is." She looked across the room toward Desiree, who was still on the dance floor, still laughing, still the center of her own celebration. For a moment my mother's expression held something I could not fully read, some internal reckoning she was conducting with herself that I was not privy to and did not need to be. Then she looked back at me. 9 clients, she said. Potentially. Potentially. Pause. And the Biltmore is one of them. The Biltmore is one of them. She looked around the room and for just a second I watched her see it differently. Not as the venue she had chosen for her favorite daughter's birthday party. As a place where her other daughter had been working for 4 months, walking these corridors, consulting with the management, quietly shaping the guest experience that had made the evening as beautiful as it was. I watched her put those 2 things together. I watched it change something in her face. She stood up slowly. "I should get back," she said. "The cake." She paused at the edge of the table. "Will you come for Sunday dinner? 2 weeks from now. I'll call you Thursday to confirm." It was not an apology. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small, specific, ordinary offer. The kind that means something precisely because it is small and specific and ordinary. "I'll come," I said. She nodded and walked back toward the center of the room. I watched her go and then I sat for a few more minutes alone at the table, listening to the jazz quartet finish a slow song and move into something brighter. I left the Biltmore at 11:15. Out through the main lobby, past the marble floors and the painted ceiling and the front desk staff who nodded as I passed the way they always did because they knew who I was. Out through the main entrance into the warm South Florida night. I stood on the front steps for a moment and breathed. The air smelled like gardenias and faint salt from the bay. I wasn't elated. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was quieter than elation and more durable. I felt like myself. Not a smaller version shaped by what my family had decided I was. Not the invisible second daughter hovering at the edges of someone else's celebration. Just Leah Delvecchio standing outside a hotel she knew well, on an ordinary Saturday night, breathing. The expanded contract with Robert Vegas Group was signed the following Monday. 9 properties across Florida. 18 months of work. The largest single engagement of my career. I sent my mother a text when I signed it, just the number 9 and a small check mark. She responded within 3 minutes with a single line. "I knew you would." It wasn't much. But coming from her after everything, it landed differently than I expected. And I was learning slowly that differently than expected was a reasonable place to start building from. 3 weeks after the party, Desiree called on a Wednesday evening and asked if we could have lunch. We met in Coconut Grove. She arrived first. She asked real questions about the consulting work and listened to the answers without redirecting once. It was, in its quiet way, the most significant conversation we had ever had. She didn't apologize for the introduction at the party. I didn't ask her to. What I needed wasn't the words. It was the change, and the change was there. I am still learning how to be seen without bracing for the moment it gets taken away. I think that will take time. But I am doing it as myself fully and without apology, and after 31 years of making myself smaller, that is everything. 18 months. That's how far we've traveled from the night of Desiree's birthday party at the Biltmore. 18 months sounds like a reasonable amount of time in the abstract, the kind of stretch where you'd expect gradual change, small adjustments, the slow settling of things that were disturbed. What actually happened was not gradual. It was a series of quiet, irreversible shifts that I didn't fully recognize as significant until I looked back at them from where I'm sitting now and realized that the woman who stood at those terrace doors watching her sister's friends laugh at her no longer exists in any meaningful way. Not because something dramatic replaced her, but because she finally stopped maintaining the conditions that kept her small. Let me tell you what the 18 months actually looked like. The Sunday dinner my mother invited me to happened on a gray February afternoon, 2 weeks after the party, exactly as promised. She called Thursday to confirm, also as promised. That alone was noteworthy enough that I wrote it in the Notes app on my phone with no caption, just the date and the word confirmed. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. I drove to the house I grew up in on a street in Coral Gables lined with live oaks that had been dropping Spanish moss since before I was born. My mother had made seafood pasta, the dish she reserved for occasions worth effort. Desiree and Marcus were there. The 4 of us sat around the table my parents had bought the year before I was born, and my mother passed the bread and asked me about the Marco Island property. Not how are you, not how's work. Marco Island by name because she had remembered what I told her at the Biltmore and had thought about it since. I answered. She asked a follow-up question. Desiree contributed something about a resort she'd stayed at near Naples, and we spent 20 minutes talking about what makes a guest experience actually land versus merely function. It was, objectively, a conversation about hospitality consulting. It was also the first family dinner in my adult life where I talked for more than 4 consecutive minutes before the subject changed. I drove home and sat in my car longer than necessary. Not because I was overcome. Just because I needed the evening to exist as a real thing before I moved past it. The Marco Island property turned out to be the most complex engagement in the expanded contract. The general manager there had been running the resort for 6 years with habits that had calcified into policy, and he was resistant in ways that required patience I didn't always feel like extending. By month 6, Marco Island had the highest front-of-house satisfaction scores in the entire group. He sent me a single-line email when the quarterly results came in. It said, "Point taken." I printed it and put it on my office wall. Robert Vega's expanded engagement ran on schedule and under budget. He signed an additional 6-month extension in October. Gerald Okafor sent a handwritten note when the extension was announced. I keep it in the same desk drawer as my first client contract from the Coconut Grove Hotel. My mother and I talked on the phone every 2 weeks through spring and summer. 20 minutes, sometimes 30. She asked about work and I told her specifically without editing myself down. She listened. There were silences in those calls with texture to them, the texture of someone building a new habit over the ruins of a very old one. I gave her room for those silences and didn't fill them with reassurance I didn't feel. Usually she found something genuine to say and we moved forward. In July she came to see one of my active properties, a boutique hotel in the design district mid-renovation, staff mid-training, everything slightly chaotic and entirely real. She walked through with me for 2 hours. I showed her the actual work, not a summary of it. The training documentation. The guest journey mapping. The unglamorous scaffolding underneath the finished experience. She asked questions I didn't expect her to know to ask. At the end she stood in the courtyard and said quietly, "You built this. Not the hotel. The methodology. The approach. The invisible thing that made the hotel what it was becoming. You built this," she said. And I said yes. And that was enough. Desiree and I had lunch 4 more times between January and August. Each one was easier than the last. She told me in June, over Vietnamese food in the Grove, that she had been thinking about the party. Specifically the introduction. She works in hotels. She said it without being prompted, the way people say things they've been carrying. I knew it was reductive when I said it. I want you to know I knew that. I told her I appreciated her saying so. We ate our food. We talked about other things. It was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get from Desiree, and I mean that without bitterness because it cost her something to say and that matters more than the format. Marcus proposed to Desiree in August on a trip to Portugal. She called me 2 days after it happened, not as part of a group text, specifically me, to tell me about the proposal. I was the first person she told after our mother. I didn't make a production of that fact. I just said congratulations and meant it, and she talked for 40 minutes about the trip and the ring and the restaurant and the way Marcus had been so nervous his hands were shaking, and I listened the way you listen when someone you share history with is genuinely happy. She asked me to be a bridesmaid. I said yes. Now here is the part of the story I have been building toward, the moment that required 18 months of everything I just described as its foundation before it could mean what it means. 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning in September, my phone rang at 7:45. I was at my desk reviewing notes from a site visit, coffee going cold beside me, the early light coming through the office window, the particular pale gold it gets in South Florida in autumn when the humidity finally releases its grip. The name on my phone screen was one I had not seen there in a long time. Long enough that seeing it produced a sensation I couldn't immediately identify, something between recognition and caution, the feeling of opening a door you haven't opened in years and not being certain what you'll find on the other side. It was my father. Raymond Delvecchio had been largely absent from my life for 11 years, not through hostility or formal estrangement, but through the slow, undramatic erosion of contact that happens when a divorce is followed by geographic distance and then by the kind of mutual silence that neither party is motivated enough to break. He lived in Sarasota now. He had remarried years ago. Beyond those basic facts, he existed in my life as a name that came up occasionally and a face I'd last seen at a cousin's wedding in 2019, where we'd exchanged 20 minutes of careful, cordial conversation and parted without making any plans. He had heard about the Biltmore. Not from my mother. From a colleague in the hospitality industry who had crossed paths with someone from Robert Vega's group at a conference in Tampa and mentioned the consulting engagement. My name had come up in a professional context and reached him the way things reach people who were never really looking, sideways and unexpectedly, when they had stopped expecting anything at all. "I've been thinking about calling for months," he said. His voice was older than I remembered and careful in the way of someone who had rehearsed the beginning of a conversation many times and was now discovering that rehearsal only takes you so far. I didn't know how to start. I told him starting was the hard part and he had already done it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard about your work. What you've built. I wanted you to know that I know about it." Pause. "I wanted you to know that I'm sorry it took me this long to call." It was not a complete accounting. It did not address 11 years of silence or the specific particular weight of being a daughter whose father had gradually become a stranger. It was not enough, not as a sum total. But it was a beginning. And I have learned over the course of the past 18 months that beginnings are not nothing. They are, in fact, the only place anything real has ever started. I told him I was glad he called. I told him we could talk more. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. All of those things were true. I am Leah Del Vecchio. I am 32 years old. I have 9 active consulting clients, a 10th in conversation, and a Sunday dinner with my mother every 3 weeks that has become, without either of us formally deciding so, a standing appointment neither of us cancels. I have a sister who is getting married in the spring and who called me last week to ask my opinion on a venue specifically because, and I want to be precise about her exact words, you actually know what makes a space work. I was not invisible. I was just unseen. There is a difference, and it took me longer than it should have to understand it. Being unseen is something that happens to you. Being invisible is something you agree to. I stopped agreeing. That was the whole of it. I stopped agreeing and the rest followed slowly and imperfectly and in ways I could not have predicted, but it followed. Whatever room you are in right now, whatever version of yourself you have been shrinking to fit a space that was never actually yours to fill, the room adjusts. Not all at once. Not without resistance. But it adjusts. You do not have to wait for permission to take up the space you have already earned. I never did. Not anymore. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional, real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.